Everyone, welcome back. Today, we're going deep on Entity Framework Core.
EF Core.
EF Core, yeah. We've got like a bunch of interview questions and answers to dig through.
Oh, cool.
So whether you're prepping for an interview, brushing up on your knowledge, or just kind of curious about this essential tool, we've got you covered.
Yeah, I think what's so cool about EF Core is it really bridges that gap between your C# code and the database. It's like having this translator that lets you work with data in this like more object-oriented way.
So less wrestling with those raw SQL queries and more elegance and efficiency.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm already interested.
Yeah.
But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's break it down.
Yeah.
What EF Core is.
Sure.
It's an object relational mapper.
Right.
What does that even mean in practical terms?
I mean, think of it this way. You have your application code, right, which is all structured around objects and classes.
Yeah.
And then you have your database, which is all tables and columns. An ORM, like EF Core, sits in the middle and kind of maps those objects in your code to the tables in the database.
Okay.
It's like this abstraction layer that lets you interact with your data in a way that just feels way more natural to how you're programming.
So instead of writing those complex SQL queries, we can just use C# to interact with our data.
Pretty much, yeah.
That sounds like a huge productivity boost.
Absolutely. EF Core is handling all that like behind the scenes work of translating your code into SQL commands that the database can understand.
Okay, all right. I'm starting to see the big picture.
Yeah.
Now let's zoom in on some key concepts, right?
Okay.
We keep hearing about entities. What role do these play in this whole setup?
I mean, entities are essentially like the heart of your data model in EF Core.
Okay.
They represent the tables in your database, but in a way that your C# code can understand.
Okay.
Imagine them as blueprints for your data objects. Each property in an entity corresponds to a column in the table.
So if I'm building, let's say, an e-commerce site, right? I might have an entity for like products with properties like product name, price, description.
Exactly.
And each product in my database would then be represented by an instance of this product entity in my code.
Exactly, yeah. And EF Core can then use that entity definition to do all sorts of things like, creating the product table in the database if it doesn't exist already.
Right.
Inserting new product records, retrieving existing product data.
So these entities are like the building blocks of our data model.
Absolutely.
But how do we actually work with them in our code?
Right.
Is there like a central hub that manages all this?
Yeah, so that's where the DB context comes in.
Right.
It's like the conductor of the data orchestra.
Okay.
DB context is a class that represents your database connection, and it provides all these methods for interacting with your entities.
So it's through the DB context that we actually like query, insert, update, delete data.
Precisely. Yeah, it's the central point of interaction between your app and the database.
Okay.
It manages your database connection. It keeps track of all your entities and how they're related. And it knows how to like translate your C# code into those SQL queries that the database understands.
This is making a lot of sense.
Good.
So we've got our entities. They represent our data.
Right.
We have our DB context. It's like the orchestrator, right?
Exactly.
What about organizing these entities?
Yeah.
Let's say we have different types of data, right? Products, customer orders. How do we handle that within EF Core?
So that's where the concept of DB sets comes in.
Okay.
A DB set represents a collection of entities of a specific type.
Okay.
So you might have a DB set for your products. You'd have a separate DB set for your orders.
Okay.
It's basically a way to group similar entities together.
So if I want to fetch all the products from the database, I would interact with the products DB set within my DB context.
You got it. And you can use LINQ queries against that DB set to retrieve the data that you need.
Now, you mentioned LINQ, and we've got to talk more about that.
Yeah.
From what I've gathered, it's pretty powerful for querying data.
Very much so.
So what is it?
So LINQ stands for Language Integrated Query.
Okay.
It lets you write queries using just regular, like, C# syntax.
Okay.
Instead of crafting those raw SQL statements, you can use LINQ methods like, where, order by, select to filter, sort, and shape your data however you need.
So it's like having this superpower that lets you query your database using the same language you're using to write your application logic.
That's a great way to put it.
Wow.
Yeah. LINQ integrates seamlessly with EF Core and makes querying your data just way more intuitive. and less error prone as well.
I'm starting to see why so many developers just rave about EF Core.
Yeah.
But before we get too deep into LNQ, I want to go back to the idea of relationships between entities. Like we talked about products and orders, right? How does EF Core handle those connections?
I mean, EF Core is incredibly good at managing relationships, which is like super important for representing those real-world data scenarios, right?
Yeah.
Like in your e-commerce example, a customer can place many orders, right?
Right. So that's like a one-to-many relationship.
Exactly.
One customer can have, multiple orders associated with them.
Exactly. And EF Core can model that relationship.
Okay.
So that when you retrieve a customer from the database, you can also easily access all of their associated orders.
So instead of writing separate queries to like fetch the customer and their orders,
right,
we can navigate that relationship directly through our code.
Exactly. EF Core handles all the joining, all that fetching logic kind of behind the scenes for you.
Wow.
And it can handle other types of relationships too, like one-to-one,
right,
where each entity on one side relates to exactly one entity on the other side.
Right.
Or many-to-many, where entities on both sides can be related to multiple entities on the other.
It's like a classic example is students and courses.
Yeah, okay, relationships. Yeah. Check. We've covered a lot of ground here, but we've barely scratched the surface.
Yeah, we got a lot more to go.
There's so much more to explore, like different ways to configure these relationships and more advanced concepts like lazy loading.
Definitely.
But before we dive into those, let's take a moment to kind of solidify our understanding of these core building blocks.
Yes.
Entities, DB context, DB sets, and relationships.
Absolutely.
Let's recap what we've learned so far and make sure we're all on the same page before we move on to that next level of EF Core mastery.
Sounds good to me.
All right, so
let's do it.
What have we learned so far?
Let's go over it.
Yeah.
So ready to dig a little deeper?
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's talk about how EF Core actually manages database connections.
Ah, yes, the lifeline between your application and all that valuable data.
Exactly.
So how does EF Core handle this crucial aspect?
Do we need to manually open and close connections every time we want to interact with the database?
No, not at all. EF Core takes care of that for you.
Okay.
The DB context that we talked about earlier plays a key role here.
Right.
When you set up your DB context, you provide a connection string
that
tells EF Core where your database is located, how to authenticate, all those important details.
So it's like giving EF Core the address and the key
to
access the database.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And from that point on, EF Core just intelligently manages the connection, opening it when it's needed for, querying or saving data, and closing it when it's no longer required. So you don't have to worry about it.
That sounds really convenient.
Yeah, it is.
But what if we need more fine-grained control over the connection?
Right.
Say, for specific database operations, that might require some custom handling.
Right.
Does EF Core allow for that level of flexibility?
Absolutely. While EF Core is great at, handling those routine connection management tasks, it also provides ways to manually control the connection if you need to.
Okay.
You can access the underlying database connection object through the DB context.
Right.
And then you can execute custom commands or perform specific operations that, might not be directly supported by EF Core's higher level methods.
So it's like having an autopilot mode for those everyday tasks.
Right.
But the option to take manual control when the situation calls for it.
Exactly.
Okay, I like it.
Yeah.
Now let's revisit those entities that form the backbone of our data model.
Okay.
I'm curious about how they're actually defined in code.
Yeah.
What does that process look like?
So entities in EF Core they're really just C# classes that represent the data that you want to store.
Okay.
Each property in the class corresponds to a column in the database table.
So we're essentially creating a blueprint of our data structure using the familiar syntax and concepts of C# classes.
Exactly. And EF Core uses those blueprints to understand how to map your objects to those corresponding database tables.
Okay.
It's like a set of instructions that tells EF Core, hey, this property, my C# class, this represents this column over here in the database table. And this other property represents that column.
Okay, I'm following so far.
Good.
But how does EF Core handle changes to our entity definitions? Let's say we rename a property in our C# class.
Yeah.
Does EF Core automatically update the corresponding column name in the database?
It's not quite that automatic.
Okay.
EF Core relies on conventions and configurations to make sure everything maps correctly.
Right.
And sometimes you'll need to provide some more explicit instructions
Okay.
using either data annotations or the Fluent API.
Okay.
These are techniques that let you fine-tune how EF Core interprets your entity definitions and how it actually maps them to that database schema.
So it's not just about defining the entities. It's also about guiding EF Core on how to translate those definitions into the database world.
Exactly. Data annotations are a way to kind of embed configuration directly within your entity classes using attributes.
Okay.
It's a convenient approach if you're dealing with, straightforward mappings and you want to keep your configuration close to your code.
But you mentioned earlier that the Fluent API offers more flexibility and control.
Yeah.
When would we opt for that approach over data annotations?
So the Fluent API really shines when you need that really granular control over how EF Core maps your entities.
Okay.
It lets you define those relationships, configure indexes, specify custom data types, handle all sorts of scenarios that, might be difficult or even impossible to achieve with just data annotations alone. It's really valuable when you're working with, more intricate database structures, or you need to kind of go beyond the conventions that EF Core provides, out of the box.
So it's like having a set of specialized tools for fine-tuning the mapping process.
Exactly.
And ensuring that EF Core aligns perfectly with our database design.
Precisely. It gives you that high degree of precision and control over how EF Core interacts with your database.
Okay.
Speaking of control, let's dive into a topic that often comes up in interviews, the different ways to configure relationships between entities.
Yeah, relationships are definitely a fundamental aspect of data modeling.
Absolutely.
Earlier, we talked about one-to-many relationships,
right?
Like a customer and their orders.
Right.
Can you give us some more real-world examples of this relationship type?
Sure. Think about a blog and its posts, right? One blog can have many posts.
Right.
But each post belongs to just one blog.
Okay.
Or a department within a company and its employees. One department can have many employees, but each employee belongs to a specific department.
So it's a pattern where one side of the relationship can have multiple instances.
Yeah.
Connected to a single instance on the other side.
Exactly.
It's like a parent-child relationship.
Right.
But in the database world.
That's a great analogy.
Okay.
And then we have one-to-one relationships where each instance on one side is linked to exactly one instance on the other.
Okay.
We talked about a passport and a person.
Right.
Can you think of some other examples?
Yeah, sure. Like a driver's license and a driver.
Yep.
Or a social security card in an individual.
Exactly. These are those scenarios where the connection is exclusive.
Right.
One entity to one other entity.
Oh, to one.
Exactly. And then there's that many-to-many scenario.
Right.
Which, often requires a bit more thought in terms of how to actually represent it in the database.
Right. Many-to-many relationships, that's where things can get a little tricky.
Yeah.
What are some common examples of this type of relationship?
So think about, students and courses.
Okay.
A student can be enrolled in many courses.
Right.
And a course can have many students or, authors and books. An author can write many books. A book can have multiple authors.
So in these cases, we can't just directly link one entity to the other.
Right.
Because the relationship goes both ways.
Exactly.
How does EF Core handle this complexity?
So EF Core introduces this idea of a join table to manage those many-to-many relationships.
Okay.
This table acts as a bridge between the two entities, and it stores the connections between them.
So instead of trying to directly connect students and courses, we create this separate table that stores the student course pairings.
Exactly. Each record in that table would represent a specific student enrolled in a specific course.
So it keeps things organized.
Yeah.
And prevents us from having to duplicate data
exactly
in the student and course tables themselves.
Exactly.
Okay, that's pretty clever.
It is, yeah. And EF Core makes it easy to work with those join tables.
Okay.
You can query and manipulate the relationships through your entities
without
having to directly interact with the join table itself.
Right.
It's all handled behind the scenes, abstracting away that complexity.
This is all making a lot of sense.
Good. I'm glad.
We've covered a lot of ground on relationships.
We have.
But there's still more to uncover.
Yes.
What other like intriguing aspects of EF Core await us?
There's a lot more to explore. In the next part, we'll delve into this concept called lazy loading.
Okay.
And we'll discuss its implications for performance.
All right.
And we'll also touch upon some other, essential aspects of EF Core, like migrations, which allow you to manage database schema changes without losing any data.
Right.
And concurrency management, which helps you handle those situations where multiple users might be trying to update the same data.
Okay. Sounds good.
Lots more to come.
Okay, so we've journeyed through, like, the core concepts of EF Core, right?
Yeah.
From entities and relationships
Right.
to database connections and the magic of LI and Q.
Mm-hmm.
But there's one more, like, fascinating concept that we need to uncover.
Yeah.
Lazy loading.
Lazy loading, yeah.
Earlier, you compared it to, like, ordering a pizza with extra toppings,
Right.
but only getting those toppings when you actually need them.
Right.
I'm really curious to see how this analogy, like, plays out in the world of data fetching.
So it's all about efficiency, right?
Right.
It's about loading related data on demand rather than upfront.
Okay.
So let's say you're building like a social media app
Okay.
where, each post can have hundreds of comments.
Yeah.
Fetching all those comments up front for every single post, even if the user doesn't want to see them,
Right.
would be a huge performance hit.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right.
So instead of loading everything at once, we're taking a more, like, selective approach,
Exactly.
only retrieving data when it's actually needed.
Yeah, it's all about optimizing for those common scenarios, right?
Yeah.
So with lazy loading, EF Core won't automatically load those comments
Right.
when you fetch the blog post.
Okay.
They'll only be loaded when you specifically access them,
Okay.
like when a user clicks on that View Comments button.
So it's like saying, hey, I might need those comments later, but
Right.
don't bother grabbing them until I ask.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This way we're avoiding like unnecessary data fetching and keeping our application running nice and smoothly.
So lazy loading can, like, significantly reduce initial query time
It can, yeah.
and memory usage.
Absolutely. It's particularly helpful in those scenarios where you have these like complex relationships.
Right.
And retrieving all the related data up front could just lead to, noticeable lag.
But wouldn't this approach then lead to, like, multiple database queries?
Right.
If we keep fetching related data, like, on demand, wouldn't that potentially be less efficient in the long run?
Yeah, that's a great question. It highlights the trade-off involved with lazy loading.
Yeah.
So while it can boost initial performance,
Mm-hmm.
frequent access to related data can trigger those multiple database trips,
Right.
which might end up being slower overall.
So it's about finding the right balance,
Exactly.
like choosing between, getting the whole pizza delivered at once.
Right, exactly.
Or, like, ordering individual slices as we get hungry.
I love that analogy.
Okay, so
It really depends on your specific scenario and how your application is actually accessing the data.
okay,
If you're pretty confident that you'll need most of the related data,
right.
loading it all up front might be the more efficient approach.
Okay.
But if you only need certain parts of it
Right.
and the access patterns are kind of unpredictable,
Yeah.
then lazy loading can be a really valuable optimization technique.
This deep dive into EF Core has been incredibly enlightening.
Good. I'm glad.
We've explored, entities, relationships, database connections, the magic of LI and Q, and even, like, delved into the nuances of lazy loading.
It's been a good journey. And remember, this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Right.
EF Core is a powerful framework with a lot more to discover.
Yeah, it feels like we've opened a treasure chest of knowledge.
Yeah,
And there's still more gems waiting to be unearthed. So
absolutely.
what else awaits us on this EF Core adventure?
So as you continue your journey, you'll encounter things like migrations, which, let you manage database schema changes without losing any data,
Right.
and concurrency management, which helps you handle those situations where you have multiple users that are trying to update the same data simultaneously. And there's a whole world of like advanced performance optimization techniques out there to explore as well.
So much to learn, so much to explore.
Yeah.
But I think for now, we've given our listeners a really solid foundation. In EF Core,
Absolutely.
we've equipped them with the knowledge and the insights to tackle those interview questions.
Yeah.
And to start building those robust and efficient applications.
Absolutely. And remember that, that choice between using the Fluent API or data annotations for configuration,
Right.
that's a key decision point.
Yeah.
So think about the complexity of your project and the level of control that you need when making that choice.
Excellent point. And for our listeners, if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, don't stop here.
Yeah, keep learning.
Keep exploring, keep experimenting, and remember, in the world of software development,
Right.
the learning never ends.
It really doesn't. Well said. Embrace the challenge, keep that curiosity alive, and enjoy the journey.
Yeah. Until next time, happy coding.
Happy coding, everyone.